Good evening, and welcome to another episode of Unlock the Door Radio. This is your host, Michael Cross here. Tonight, I have a very special guest. You've probably heard of her. It's Rosa Koire, who wrote the book Behind the Green Mask. And, I'm just going to turn things over to Rosa and let her tell us what inspired her to write the book, what's in it, and then we're just going to go from there. Hello, Rosa.
Hi. Great to be with you, Michael.
Oh, thanks. Well, tell us, basically, before we get into the book, I just want to say this. The image I think most people have of people who question what's going on in society today is that you're probably a Tea Party, conservative, Southern Baptist churchwoman who now is just jumping in there, maybe following in the footsteps of Sarah Palin and tackling the issues. Does that describe you?
No, it actually doesn't describe me at all. And you're right. That is one of the things that's unusual about me being sort of a spokesperson for the movement of thinking people who are questioning what's happening with United Nations Agenda 21 Sustainable Development and its impacts around the world. My background is, I'm a liberal. I come out of a liberal tradition, from Los Angeles. I went to UCLA. I was, politically active mainly in national issues, anti-war, pro-choice, pro-gay rights. And, when I was, my career, I spent my career as a, commercial and industrial real estate appraiser, valuing land for the government, for the Department of Transportation. I was a district branch chief for the California Department of Transportation, and an expert witness on land use and land value. So that's where I'm coming from, a liberal tradition, and also rooted in fact-based information source declamatory stuff. So when I started to, when I was valuing property around 2002, I started to notice that there was a sort of a planning revolution going on. And that people's property, that earlier I had been able to determine what could be done with property. But around that year, I started to notice that the planning departments were not able to tell me what someone could do with their land, and that made it very difficult to value it. And when I started to research that, I found that it wasn't just in the San Francisco Bay Area where I am based. It was national. And then as I looked into it further, I found that it was international.
Okay.
And as I began...
Yeah, I just want to back up for 1 second there. So people can understand this. So you're saying that you got a piece of land and someone wants to buy it. They need to know, for instance, if this could wind up being declared a wetland and unusable for any kind of business or residential, right?
Well, yes, that's true too. But what I was looking at was just basically what could you put on it? In terms of, generally people know if land is zoned, like let's say you have land zoned for commercial use, you figure you can put a commercial building on it. But what I was finding was that your zoning was fairly irrelevant, and that in fact there were so many hurdles to being able to use your property, whether it had a building on it or not. It was a sea change. It was a radical change where before around 2002, I'd been able to value property and the government. My purpose was that the government was acquiring property for freeway purposes and, buying property under eminent domain. So I really needed to know what the property could be used for so I could fairly compensate the property owners who were losing their property to the government. And by, going and checking on what land could, what you could do with land, that's how you determine how much it's worth. So, because there was this huge change where suddenly I wasn't really able to tell what people could do with their property because the planning departments were not telling me what people could do, and in fact they were blocking people who owned property from being able to use it. And that was a very big change. And what when I researched this later, I found that through United Nations Agenda 21, Sustainable Development, which is an international plan signed on to by 179 nations, because of that, the United States had agreed to it in 1992 and had actually brought Agenda 21 into the United States, and all federal agencies had changed their policies to conform to it. And this had then influenced policy throughout the United States and, of course, other nations, but in the U.S., locally. And this is where you see it, is locally. So that was what I was seeing in 2002. That was when the actual implementation of the land use plans began to spread across the United States. So this is how I became politicized around this issue. I'm not, this is not a political issue. It's not a left-right issue. It has nothing to do with my liberal point of view, or whether I'm gay or whatever, or whether whether I'm conservative, which I'm not. But the thing is that this is being framed by the press as being sort of a right-wing tinfoil hat issue, so that the major concerns of the people of the United States and the world can be ignored.
Yeah, so you get pigeonholed into kind of this is what a person looks like, acts like, and in every other respect, and therefore it's easy to dismiss people if you're not part of the so-called cultural mainstream then.
The other thing it does too is it chills your civil rights, because if you don't, like somebody like me, I am a liberal, and if I was a little bit weaker person, I'd be afraid to speak out, because I would be afraid that I would get smeared as I consider it a smear. It's funny, but to be called conservative or right wing or whatever, so what it does is it affects your ability to be able to express yourself. It chills your civil rights, and because no one wants to be labeled as being a fringe person. So that's another way that it propagandized. This is a philosophy that actually effectively changes the way that people express themselves. It neutralizes the opposition. And this is systemic. It's endemic to this plan, to the way that this plan is implemented around the world.
Isn't there, I'm probably getting ahead of myself here, but isn't there, like when you go to planning commissions and stuff like that, is it called Delphi or something? It's a technique in which you can, if you word things right, you can build consensus within a group to where maybe you come in there feeling a certain way, but things are worded in such a way that kind of neutralizes the opposition.
Right. Yeah. Well, this is something that people see all over the world, and that's because the individuals who are running meetings are being trained. And, they're being trained in organizational management. And one of the techniques is a RAND Corporation mind control technique that was developed post-World War II, to bring groups of people to a predetermined outcome while giving them the impression that it was all their idea. So, in other words, when you go into a government meeting where you're being asked for your opinion on a great new plan for the center of your town, some kind of a land use plan or a regional plan, you get invited to go and, vote, but you're not really voting. It's, this is just like, they give you a handful of poker chips that you're supposed to drop into different little containers on, whatever plan you like, for your town. But the truth is that these plans have all been designed in advance, and they're all the same plan all across the world. And these are regional plans that are designed to consolidate municipalities so that they can be more easily managed and controlled. And the populations are, the concept of consensus is that rather than voting, you're just going to sort of be in a conglomeration of agreement. And the point of it is that if you don't happen to be present, you agree sort of by default that others who are present will make a determination for you without your input. So basically what that means is that you're set up for the individual to lose influence on what happens around the world politically, and in particular in land use. And that's where this plan is seen primarily, is in the way that your city is designed. Because the plan for Agenda 21 Sustainable Development is to move populations out of rural and suburban areas into high-density urban centers where they can be more easily managed and controlled. The story that you're given is that this is for greenhouse gas emission reduction, and that if you're in the center of a city and you have no personal vehicle, you can be moved more efficiently by using public transportation. So, and the idea is that public transportation is so expensive to develop and maintain that it can't be moved out to the rural and suburban areas. Instead, it's better to move the people into the city centers. But so that's why it's essential to change land use plans so that you cannot use your rural and suburban areas, and so that your city centers become denser and denser with higher buildings and more tightly packed people. This is kind of how this is designed.
Okay, let me find out for sure here. Is this a law that was created, or is it one of those kind of resolutions? I'm reminded back in the 80s that a senator from Oregon had created a population. It was a bill that was to. It wasn't a law like China's. Everyone has one kid or something like that. Instead, it was a resolution calling upon, in this case, federal agencies in America to work within the guidelines. And of course, the problem is with resolutions is they're often, whereas you don't get thrown in jail for not following it, it's one of those things that's very intimidating. Is it that kind of thing where maybe the land use boards at state and then local levels, they feel like, well, we better do this because this is what the government's telling us we had better do, hint, hint, and then therefore they do it?
Well, this is really very interesting because the way that, this is how you have to ask yourself how someone can be called a tinfoil hat, nut when we're looking at actual plans. And, you just look at your town plan, it's right there. So the way that this developed was that United Nations Agenda 21 Sustainable Development is not law. It's not a treaty. It's soft law. It was agreed to by 179 nations by consensus. And then in the United States, it was brought back to the U.S. George Bush signed it. George H.W. Bush signed it. And then Clinton created the President's Council on Sustainable Development in 1993. That ran until 1999. And so what happened there was that they determined that the best way to get the United Nations Agenda 21 into the cities and states was, was to make it more of a land use plan so that it could be spread into every small community, because it's a global plan, but it's implemented locally. So in that case, what happened was that federal agencies had all changed their policies to conform with this plan. And what they did then was they gave grants. For instance, the Partnership for Sustainable Communities is HUD, DOT, Department of Transportation, and in the Environmental Protection Agency, 3 federal agencies together giving grants, $100 million a year in grants just for planning to cities and counties and states all across the United States. And this is so that they'll change their land use plans all across the United States to conform with this. So that's one way that local municipalities are influenced by funding. The other thing is that this is a plan to regionalize the United States, because there's a great quote by Zbigniew Brzezinski. He said this in 1995. He was the national security advisor to Carter, and so after that in 1995, he said, you can't have full globalization all in one jump. You have to have an interim step, and that is regionalization. And this is what United Nations Agenda 21 Sustainable Development is. It is a globalization plan. It essentially is a totalitarian plan that consolidates municipalities, because the idea is that you want to have supposedly what you're told is it's more efficient. But of course, if you're looking at the ultimate in efficiency in a governmental plan, that would be a dictatorship. So what this is then is a plan to move people into areas where they can be more easily monitored and controlled, and to also consolidate government. And this is what a regionalization plan does. And that's what we're seeing right now going on across the United States.
You know, I've often wondered, I don't know if you go into this too much, but it seems that there's a mindset, and I'm not talking conspiracy, I'm not talking X-Files, type of thing where people are determining who's winning the Super Bowl this year or anything like that. But, Noam Chomsky, talks about an idea that the people that often get called the elite, the influential people, they go to the same universities, they come from the same families, they intermarry into the same families. There's a certain norm that's set, certain values that are part of their mainstream that may not be part of the regular people, 99% of the population's mainstream values, but it's part of their value set. And it seems that the more you study issues dealing with population and so forth, you get the idea that the people that are in the influential positions see population as a negative thing. They see low birth rates as a positive thing, despite all the dire warnings against low birth rates in Western world and much of Asia and so forth. And I'm just wondering if maybe one of the reasons that they like this is because, well, I knew this guy who was a Irish Catholic, and he got married, but he and his wife wound up living in a small apartment, and they just had a kid, and I said, well, so how many kids are you going to have? And he's like, well, I don't know, because a small apartment's a pretty good form of birth control. And I'm just wondering if that's part of it. You get people into apartment houses, there's not that much room. Even in the Soviet era when they were encouraging people to have kids, well, those apartments they had people in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and so forth, were barely bigger than most people's living rooms. I mean, that was all the rooms fit into what you would consider a normal living room. And of course they only had one, maybe two kids.
Yeah, that's right. And, it's very interesting because I speak all across the United States. And in fact, I just came back from Europe where I spoke. And, I was talking to some people in, I think it was Washington, D.C., young people who were telling me that, they just really cannot afford to get married. They can't afford to start their families because the apartments that they're in are very expensive and they're small. And this is one thing, the lie of high-density development is that it's going to be more affordable. In fact, it's gentrification of dense urban downtown city centers, and it makes it more expensive. The other thing is that, in talking about mindset, obviously this entire plan cannot move forward without education. And so in fact, it's influential in how people are, how people's minds are developed, how they are taught to think, and what they're taught to be, that is valuable. And I can speak as someone who came out of the early 70s era of Club of Rome, Limits to Growth, and Zero Population Growth. I decided when I was 16 not to have any children after reading Limits to Growth, which came out in 1972. And this plan, although, was codified with Agenda 21 in 1992, of course it's an old plan. It's, you can take it back you could take it back before the Fabians, but the Fabian socialists in the 1880s in England, this has always been kind of a elitist, Ivy League-ish, education-based group of people who see themselves as the thought leaders. And in fact, they're now, this is basically technocrats. So the idea is that through regulation, through manipulation, through restriction and direction, you can actually change the way people think and change the way they live. Because clearly, where you live has a lot to do with how you live and what you're going to do with your life. So, I agree. If you're in a small apartment, it's going to be difficult for you to conceive of having, 3 children or 5 children or what. And the idea, of course, is that people are educated to think that they are damaging the planet if they exist, and that in order to save the planet, they have to limit the human species, and that the carrying capacity of the planet is so limited that and that everything that people do is so negative that in fact this is the best way to preserve life is to actually restrict it.
Yeah, I know. In my training, in my educational background, one of the things that we went over was, now I want to get into this whole idea so we can shoot down the whole conspiracy thing, but what we were trained in one area was how you go into a small, maybe very traditional community and you get the people to adopt a pro-birth control stance. This was in an advanced community health organizing seminar I took. And the thing is that you were supposed to find out what motivated people's values, then market to those values to change their ideas and so forth. And I think it's very easy for people to see that as being, well, that's education. But if you actually look at what a lot of people call conspiracy, it is just doing that same thing. I mean, if I went into a community with a couple other people and we started working with the people that were the leaders in that community to try to educate the people to change their attitudes, aren't we conspiring to change people's attitudes? I mean, but yet we would still see that as ourselves. We would look at that and say, no, we're going in and educating people. We're change agents for positive things. Maybe that's the way the elite think about this. Well, we're trying to save the planet, and this is the way to go about it. But yet, in the general community, maybe the general community would be like, hey, wait a minute, I don't want this. But yet, if you kind of sell it little by little by little, then they'll adopt it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, social engineering and behavioral modification is essential to this plan. And, in fact, that is really the role of education in this plan. It's not about teaching you how to think. It's about directing how you think and how you live. And I found an example of that when I was getting ready to go speak in, I think I was going to Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I was looking at I always check out the universities in particular areas and what their programs of sustainability are, because all the universities have sustainability programs. And we're not talking about, I'm not talking about creative reuse and recycling here. I'm talking about changing the way that people think. This is definitely designed to work on people's interaction with each other, on how they are reacting to culture, on how they're creating culture. So at the University of Oklahoma, it's University of Oklahoma, they have a program there, a transformational program, which is every single student has to go through this, and it's about breaking down your earlier training wherever you've come from, and showing you that you have prejudices, and it's likened to shock treatment, where you learn that you do not rely on your social connections from your family. That in fact you're being redesigned as someone who is breaking all of their connections with their past and with their family, and instead reconnecting to the school. And so when you have courses that are 500 courses at UCLA that deal in sustainability, it's not that they're teaching you how to recycle. What they're teaching you is how to think about yourself as a person in the global community. You're a global citizen. And this is a communitarian mindset, which is redirecting you away from thinking about the individual as being primary, and instead about thinking of yourself in terms of a mass. And if you're an American and you adhere to the United States Constitution, what you're given in the Constitution is a guarantee that your individual rights and freedoms are protected by the government. But communitarianism says that the individual's rights have to be balanced with the rights of the community, the global community. And that means that those rights, you never know what the rights of the global community are. They're not delineated, not written, and you're always going to be in conflict with them. The individual will always be outweighed by the so-called rights of the community. So this is how, the sort of the philosophy of the technocrat, that we can legislate and manipulate and control the individual to the point where everything is easily monitored. And the point of globalization is the way you get to globalization is through standardization of all systems. You can't control everything unless it all matches up, unless it's all controllable. And the way to do that is to systematize manipulate it. So standardization of all systems, including the educational system and the land use system, is a step in globalization. And this is essentially where we're going with this. It takes the humanity out of the human equation and instead makes it manipulatable and controllable and measurable. This is an essential part of creating a so-called efficient system.
Yeah. Now, there may be people out there that are thinking, now wait a minute, how does this sort of thing work? Again, we're getting back to conspiracy theory. And what I would actually encourage people to do is look up B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner, and look up, it's really easy. Look up B.F. Skinner, Ideal Society. And he talks about this. He's one of the big foundational, I would say, it's kind of a mixture between philosophy and psychology, but he's right up there with Freud and Jung and the rest of them, and he talks about this. That if you can create a society that people, it's cheaper to make people that will fit into society than it is to create a society that everyone will enjoy. So the idea is that you have to control every aspect of their reward punishment system. And that, of course, they look at people like, Skinner said, we're just pigeons. We're just really much more advanced pigeons. And so if we control education, we control, and then, of course, the people coming out of the universities, some of them will rebel against it, but 90% will just assume this is the right way and not question it. They go into the media, they become school teachers, professors, so forth, lawyers, land use planners, and they'll have that, won't they? I mean, they will continue this, and it's not conspiracy. It is actually a mindset. And, go ahead.
Well, that's very interesting. Of course, Skinner, if people are looking for an easy way into Skinner, you can just read Walden 2. Which is, his design of the ideal society and, and how welcoming that's going to be when everyone, can just sort of slide into, to a situation where they're, it's, completely fully designed. And there's a wonderful speculative fiction story called Walden 3 that's, I don't know if you've seen that. It's a brilliant story on what it is that happens when you have a controlled society like that. Another great book to read is Erich Fromm's Escape from Freedom. Because the question, what we're looking at here is totalitarianism and how appealing it is to people. Why, the big question, the thing is that what we're talking about requires a huge sea change in philosophy and sociological response by a tremendous portion of your population. And so people think about this and they think, well, how can this be happening? It's going to require hundreds of thousands of people participating in the remaking of society. And the answer to that is yes, it is happening like that. And in fact, it's quite understandable how this would be so attractive and appealing to people when their training is based in it, when we're looking at manufactured consensus where dissent is either frowned upon or not permitted, where you're feeling that you want to be part of something big and you're being told that it's a positive thing, that you're creating a clean, open world, open society where everyone is cared about and listened to, and that only those people who are antisocial will critique it. And that way, you're feeling that you don't, even if you feel uneasy or uncomfortable about it, you don't want to expose yourself as being one of those people that doesn't want to go along with it. And I think a brilliant book for that, of course, is Escape from Freedom by Erich Fromm, because he does talk about, he wrote that after World War II. The question was, how could Hitler's Germany have happened? And of course, I think it's very fascinating how he breaks that down. But the issue is primarily that there was a mindset in advance in that culture that looked to a leader to give the answers. And I think when we elevate our educational system to a point where we are not able to dissent, or where if you do dissent, you're not going to get a job, you're not going to, you'll be called a conspiracy theory right-wing nut, or tinfoil hat or something. When the stakes are too high, then there are way too many opportunities for you to just go along, and that's what's happening. People are going along with this. They don't want to think deeply about it, and or they're so indoctrinated through their educational system that they think it's a good thing. This is what we need to work with and against.
Well, I would remind people, I think a lot of times we become arrogant and think that education makes us more independent. But like you said, if you go along, you get better grades in many universities, you get into the graduate schools, you get your PhDs or masters and so forth. And if you dissent, you might wind up making some professor angry at you and wind up not getting those degrees. But I just reminded them of the Milgram study, the electric shock therapy study. Yeah. People should look that one up. They seriously should look that one up, Milgram. And the thing was that the more educated someone was, the more likely they were to go ahead and not, they thought they were giving a lethal dose of electricity to somebody. But they were more likely to say yes, because I think it was part of the training process that you trust the guy in the lab coat who says, you're not responsible, give him the shock.
Yeah, I do bring this up in my book, which is Behind the Green Mask, UN Agenda 21. And I talk about the this Zimbardo experiment at Stanford University, which is a famous the Stanford Prison Project experiment, where he put just a group of university students. One half were designated as jailers, and the other half were the prisoners, and just let them just basically created a so-called jail in the basement of one of the Stanford University buildings. And within 6 days, they had to stop the project because they were torturing one half of the students was torturing the other half.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it was Zimbardo's wife that told him to stop because he was getting too much into it. He was enjoying being the important. But that's the thing. I mean, human beings, I was watching a PBS documentary. It's somewhat dated now. It was on the NSA. And what was interesting was it was done during the Bush administration. And you had some of the very liberal Democrats, some of the big names, and they were just ripping into this whole thing about, you're kidding us, the NSA is spying on us. And now, those same Democratic senators are the harshest supporters, or the biggest supporters. I mean, they're defending it. Because now they're the ones who are kind of in charge of that. There is this mindset that it seems that human beings just kind of gravitate to, if they're getting something out of it, they may wind up not being as nice as they were when you knew them when they were more normal people.
Yeah, I know. It's basically, do you want to be the ruler? And if you do, you're going to create the rule, that benefits yourself. And this is why I say it's not a left-right thing, because it's really about power. And it's irrelevant, if you're a globalist, it doesn't matter whether you profess to be a Republican or a Democrat or whatever it is you're going to be. It's that, you're setting up the world so that it's going to be, more manageable. And I think something, I found, back in July of 2012, Time magazine put out a sort of a little blurb on where the jobs are going to be within the next 10 years. And, the top jobs are in things like retinal imaging machines, satellite imaging, data storage, and social networking. And so basically what they've done is they've completely changed the culture so that we can be monitored. And this is where National Security Agency and domestic surveillance comes in with the National Defense Authorization Act, because this plan, what we're talking about with the United Nations Agenda 21 Sustainable Development, it's a whole life plan. So it involves every aspect of your life. And in order to manage it, it works to have populations consolidated into dense city centers, and to take away mobility for people who are in those city centers, and also to restrict use of the rural areas and the suburban areas. One other thing you're going to see with movement and control of populations is that products are offered to the population which you'll voluntarily purchase, so that you'll actually be assisting in this monitoring and surveilling of you, which, like, for instance, obviously Facebook and having a global positioning device on you at all times, which is your smartphone, but also things like intelligent home and all of these other products which wire up your house with video, interior video, so that your interior property is being surveilled. And you're paying for it. And so this is how they change the mindset of the population to deliver what it is that that the government or whoever it is that's managing this entire project, this technocracy project, so that they're able to move forward with their plan.
Now, two things on that one. One is, I live outside the United States now, and so usually the only entertainment I watch on television is movies and so forth. And I'm very careful in choosing the good ones. So once in a while I'll find a series, I don't know, like Walking Dead or something I really enjoy. But we signed up for a movie, one of the, Netflix and so forth. So my wife's been going through and checking television shows now. And she likes crime dramas and things like that, but she asked me today, for instance, she switched one on, and I thought it was very interesting that the basic plot of this show, and she's shown me a couple others because it's, we just recently got this, so it's like, well, let's check this one out, see what it's like, and this one. there seems to be this kind of pattern of that any kind of federal agency now is like the good guys, and they start showing all these little gadgets, everything from, being able to insert a RFID chip somewhere so they can surveil someone, or using cameras all over the city to track people and stuff like that. But it's presented as a real positive thing. I saw one show, my wife was watching a comedy, in which they had a real heartwarming section where this guy was able to keep his business because he was able to get a contract with a drone company and save his business and keep his people working. And I'm thinking, wait a minute. I mean, does this just happen? Because I do know that there's been since World War II a very strong alliance between Hollywood and the defense industry. And now it's just like, what? You're selling us on how wonderful? I mean, the TSA, they're presented as heroes. The Homeland Security, well, we're out there, making sure we're keeping an eye on all the Amish terrorists or something. And it's so pervasive. I had too much film literature in college to be able to watch a show and not see the political slant that the writers or producers or whatever have in this. And it's atrocious. And you really see that when you're outside the United States for a few years. You really see it. And
it's really
go ahead.
Well, I'm obviously, entertainment is, what is that? It's when you are in a state of receptivity when you're watching something. It involves your audio, your visual, and your all of your cognitive senses, and you sort of suspend disbelief because you're accepting something that you're watching, even though it's fictional, but you're watching it and allowing it to influence you as if it's real. Just your body, your physical response to it is real, and so you're in a state of receptivity, and obviously it's about behavioral modification and social engineering. This is what Bernays. This is about being able to influence the population to think in a particular way, and it's always been going on. But the problem here is that it's worldwide, and the idea is to standardize the mindset around the world to accept this sort of technocracy, and they call it lifelong learning. They're saying that it's transformative learning, and they're actually planning, that the idea is to change human nature. And this is what you see a lot with young people. They say, well, we've changed. People are being changed. They're not, we're creating people who are not violent, who are nonviolent, who can relate to one another in a way so that they can accept what they're hearing from one another. But the problem is that they're not hearing anything that is that creates dissent between them. That the idea is that everyone has a truth, and that there is no such thing as objective reality. And if there's no such thing as objective reality, then you're never wrong or right. It's just your point of view. This is what's wrong with what's going on now, is because when I tell you a truth right now, what I'm talking about is factual and it's truthful. But you can then say that it's just my opinion because it's just my point of view, and reject it instead of acting on this information. Mm-hmm. And this is what's dangerous about manipulating populations in this way.
Oh, but it does work. Anyone that looks up what Bernays wrote, it's just gotten better. I mean, Bernays wrote propaganda in 1928, and now we've just had more and more and more time to perfect that. It's interesting, though, when you made the comment about monitoring people, I've noticed that if you, at least sometimes when you look at, I was watching something BBC pointed out that they were talking about microchips. Now, if you use the word microchip, people start going, the defenses go up like, oh yeah, alien stuff. But you know what I mean? They have this kind of, they've had this built in. And then of course they hear microchip on a crime drama where the FBI is using something to save the world. Then, they start accepting that as being good. But I, was watching this documentary where they pointed out that now in places like England and Germany, if you want to, you can tell what someone buys, because it will all have like a little tiny microchip. These things are really cheap. You can make millions of them for hardly anything. You'll tell what someone buys, how long it's in their house, when it gets thrown away, and if they put it in the wrong recycling bin, we're talking Europe, then they'll get a fine or might even face jail time if it happens enough times. And if you say this to the average American, they're like, no, that's conspiracy. But at the same time, this is something that they can go and watch, more European-oriented programs like BBC, and they'll find documentaries that will talk about this. Of course, sometimes they have kind of a pro slant to it, like, well, this would be a good idea. You want to worry about someone stealing your money or something like that. You can just walk through the checkout line or whatever. But the thing is that it is real. I mean, it is something that the technology's here. It's already starting to go and be applied. And you say how it'll affect people's lives. Well, if you throw away something and you think something looks more, plastic than it looks, metal, because some products contain both, you throw it in the wrong recycle thing, you get a really nasty note from your municipality saying, well, you've had one infraction. If you get two more, you'll receive this fine. That is how it will affect people's lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is really fascinating. There's so many ways, that we can take off from this point. But in addition to the issue of monitoring, and RFID chips, of course, are real. You've got one in your passport, probably. This is not, some fantasy thing. This is real, and it's a way of, of monitoring, tracking. But the end point on this, of course, too, is criminalization. And this is another element of population control manipulation, because many more things are being criminalized now. So you may think that you're not doing anything wrong, but then you find out that in fact, yes, you are. Whether it goes all the way from land use and where they're criminalizing the codes. The code sections for your city, so that if you don't respond to a note saying that you've got a window in your house that was put in incorrectly or without a permit, that's a criminal act. If you don't respond to the city within a certain number of days, they can actually take criminal action against you. So this is another part of the United Nations Agenda 21 Sustainable Development is prisons and public-private partnerships through being able to restrict how it is that the public responds to controls that are put on them by large government agencies and directed down through the municipalities. Because the plan is dependent on the illusion of public buy-in. That's part of this plan is, for instance, Sustainable America, A New Consensus, which was a book that was put out by the President's Council on Sustainable Development. That was put out to determine how it was that all these populations were going to be managed psychologically. Basically, that if you don't have the illusion of public buy-in, the population is going to say that we aren't part of this. This is not our plan. So then, when you take it down to, throwing stuff out and having RFID chips in it, how is it that you're going to manipulate and control this large population? How do you manage them through the smart grid, through, determining how they're using electricity and gas and, all of their power and water, and then through their actual use of products and disposal of products. So in all ways, the population is being more closely watched and more closely controlled. And then the end game on that is also to, what are you going to do with that population when they break those rules? So it's more rules and also more penalties. And this is something that, we are not trending towards this inexorably. There is something that we can do. We need to refuse, resist, refuse to participate. This is very essential now. You don't want to go along to get along with this plan. We are not passive observers. We are active participants in our lives.
Yeah, I think we really need to to take that to heart. I mean, I like to do photography, and I even have pictures on my Facebook of like reservoirs and stuff like that. But then I noticed that there was one of those Homeland Security fusion videos or something like that, and that got leaked out on YouTube, and they said that if someone's taking pictures like at a reservoir, well, that's something maybe you should go and shows the cop going up and asking this young woman what she's doing there, but kind of like there's nothing illegal about doing it, but let's intimidate her and persuade her to leave. And I was just thinking, what a person could do in that situation. If you're just out taking some nature shots and some cop thinks, oh, I wonder if this is a terrorist or something, is just say, am I required by law to leave, and just stay. Don't listen to them. I mean, you have not done anything wrong. They're just trying to get into this idea that I just remember how silly it sounded when I was in college and I was told in the Soviet Union you couldn't take pictures of anything that had any kind of military application, including gas stations. Of course, that's changed now. Russia, you can take those pictures. In America, it's starting to go the other way, where all of a sudden, you're taking pictures of a dam. Maybe you're planning on doing something nasty there, or maybe you're taking pictures of a reservoir. You plan on throwing something in there and polluting the water supply or something.
Mm-hmm. I know that the whole if you see something, say something, and you find yourself participating in that. Someone puts a bag down on the sidewalk, and what it does is it changes the entire mindset of a nation, of the world. And so I believe we've been terrorized, that the war on terror is a war on us. And, you don't need to go any further than an airport to see that when you're, stopped and frisked before you can get on a plane. I never go through the machine. I always make them pat me down. And I talk to the person who's patting me down, and I tell them that, I always ask them, do you ever find anything? And they don't really ever find anything. This is about intimidation, and it's about creating a mindset that you are a criminal. You feel guilty when that's happening to you. You know that, you're afraid. You wonder if they're going to find something even though you don't have anything. And what this does is it just conditions the population to accept being violated and to accept seeing someone else being violated. And this is why it's so essential that you keep your individuality and your belief in what you are as an individual thinker. And even if you join a group, you must join it, as an individual. You always question what it is that you're accepting, what it is that you're participating in, because otherwise you're just a faceless, nameless mass going along. And this is how it is possible to create a totalitarian state.
Well, I talked to a group of young people the other day, and I asked them, thanks to all the NSA stuff, have you not written a response to a YouTube or put a Facebook post up or something like that because you were afraid the government was monitoring you and it could be used against you? And half of them raised their hands. And that's scary because Harry S. Truman, I believe, very respected Democratic president, said that if America turned into a country where you were afraid to express your opinion, it would no longer be a democracy.
That's right.
And of course, Jimmy Carter recently said America isn't a democracy anymore.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's very clear. There's no question about it. It's incremental. This entire plan is incremental. And so, that's how you can, I really go into this in my book too, and I have some really excellent examples of how this can be done, just in a group of people. For instance, when you're in a government meeting and you're invited to give your opinion, and half of the people, unbeknownst to you, half of the people in that group are actually either working for the government or working for their consultant who is putting on this meeting. And so if you don't agree, you feel completely isolated and scary to actually stand up and say, the emperor's got no clothes on,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's difficult to do that. And this is, when you are brought up in a school system that teaches you in a cohort where you're part of a large group of kids or you're part of a group of people that you go through school with, you don't want to be rejected because we're social people. We want to be part of a group, and you learn to restrict what your thoughts are, what you're going to say, because you don't want to be in that position of cognitive dissonance where you believe one way and have to express another way. Instead, you want to have unity in your mind and your actions. And this actually, it actually creates a whole mindset and a whole philosophy for people. This is how something like this can happen. And it is international. This plan is not just something that, is in the United States. It's all across the world now. And the other issue is that, I'm very appreciative of alternative so-called media because mainstream media does not want this information out. It's owned by 5 major corporations. This is a corporatocracy in progress. It's a totalitarian corporate state that's being erected worldwide. And that's why you're not going to see this in the mainstream press. So I have online, I have YouTube videos of myself being interviewed by the Huffington Post, by Reuters, by the American Bar Association, by other press. And then, I usually film myself when I'm being interviewed, and then I put that side by side with the article so that people can see how it is that this information is either marginalized or slammed or smeared, when in fact it has nothing to do with how I've given my interview. This is actually the way that people are trained, and also this is the way that you, as a viewer, as a listener, as a reader, will experience dissent. You will see that this is what happens to people who dissent.
But the very important,
they are attacked.
Yeah, the very important thing to note, though, again, back to one of those 1970s psychological studies, which they were actually trying to promote individuality back in the 70s, is the dissident effect. If one person in a large audience will question the speaker, the compliance that is shown later in the audience will dip dramatically. It destroys the speaker's credibility. It's the whole emperor has no clothes thing. If someone is good at questioning the speaker, and you've probably noticed this at meetings, and no one's talking, one person gets up, they say something that refutes everything that speaker was saying. Suddenly everyone's going, hey, yeah, and what about this and this and this and this and this? That's what we need more of.
Well, that's kind of what I train people to do in my book, anti-Delphing these meetings. And that's why, another reason why the government and the consultants, and this is what a public-private partnership is government and consultants working together along with private foundations and nonprofits. But what happens in these meetings is that a lot of times they'll stack these meetings with people who are government employees or board appointees or consultant employees, so that there are enough people in the audience already who can then will actually shout you down. If you start to dissent, they will shout you down, they will mock you, they will laugh at you. And this is, I'm sorry if it sounds like it's some kind of a conspiracy. The fact is, this is real. It's really happening, and it's not just in one area. It happens all across the U.S. at least.
Well,
this is what I've been doing for the last 3.5 years is traveling around the United States and giving speeches and actually meeting with government elected officials, educating them. This is all across the United States. This is a plan that is being implemented across the world. The San Francisco Bay Plan Bay Area, which is the regional plan for the Bay Area, and which we are suing to stop. That is the exact same plan as the Hanoi, Vietnam regional plan, the 2030 regional plan. It's the same plan all across the U.S. Behind the Green Mask, UN Agenda 21. Get it on Amazon. It's on Kindle, Nook.